The overcast sky announced a cold day, while the wind swept through the deserted cemetery. The grandson guided his sick grandfather through the aisle of gravestones with slow and controlled steps. The frail and gasping old man did not perceive the hidden fate on that path. In front of a freshly dug grave, the young man let go of his grandfather's arm and pushed him without hesitation. The body fell between the walls of earth while the young man remained silent at the edge. In the distance, the strong bark of a German shepherd tore through the silence and approached at a run. The animal appeared among the crosses, staring fixedly at the scene without looking away. The grandson's face wavered for an instant when the dog positioned itself on the edge of the grave. But what happened in that second, no one would ever forget. Do you like stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, let's get back to our story. The morning had begun grey, with a cold wind sweeping across the empty cemetery. Harold Whitmore, weakened by the illness that had accompanied him for years, walked with hesitant steps, relying on the firm arm of his grandson, who guided him to that place. At first glance, the scene conveyed a sense of care and respect. But behind the young man's gestures lay hidden intentions that no one could imagine. The grandfather believed this visit was simply to say goodbye to an old friend, but the truth was that Tyler already carried within him a dangerous decision, born of ambition, impatience, and accumulated resentment. Harold's breathing had grown, more labored over the past months, and his doctor in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had warned him that his condition was deteriorating. The small town where he had lived his entire 78 years seemed to grow quieter each day, as if preparing him for something he wasn't ready to face. His late wife, Martha's grave, lay somewhere among these weathered headstones, and he had promised himself he would visit her before his time came. But today felt different. Tyler had insisted on accompanying him, something that struck Harold as both touching and unusual. "Careful, Grandpa," Tyler said, his voice carrying what seemed like genuine concern as they navigated between the rows of granite markers. "The ground is uneven here. We don't want you to take a tumble." Harold nodded, though something in his grandson's tone made him pause. At 26, Tyler had always been different from his siblings. Where his sister Emma showed warmth and his brother Jake displayed honest ambition, Tyler possessed a calculating nature that Harold had noticed but never quite understood. The young man had been asking increasingly pointed questions about Harold's will lately, questions disguised as concern for his grandfather's well-being. The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of the old oak trees that dotted Millbrook Cemetery. Harold pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his frail frame. The medication he took made him feel constantly cold, and the dampness in the air seemed to seep into his bones. Tyler wore a newer jacket, expensive-looking, which struck Harold as odd since his grandson had been complaining about money troubles just last week. "How much further?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a bit more," Tyler replied, guiding him deeper into the cemetery, past the older section where Harold's parents rested, past the area where Martha's headstone bore fresh flowers that Emma must have placed there. They were heading toward the back of the property, where newer plots waited for future occupants. Harold felt a twinge of confusion. Martha's grave was in the opposite direction, and he was certain Tyler knew this. They had attended her funeral together 5 years ago, had stood side by side as the pastor spoke about eternal rest and heavenly reunions. So why were they walking away from her resting place? "Tyler," Harold began, his voice catching slightly. "I thought we were visiting your grandmother." Tyler's grip on his arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, we will, Grandpa. I just wanted to show you something first. Something important." The path they followed wound between sections of the cemetery that Harold rarely visited. Here, the maintenance seemed less careful. The grass grew wilder between the graves, and an occasional fresh mound of earth indicated recent burials. Harold noticed a few open plots, graves that had been dug but not yet filled, waiting for services scheduled for later in the week. It was a sight that always made him uncomfortable, these yawning openings in the earth that seemed to beckon with dark promises. Tyler had been unusually attentive over the past month, visiting more frequently than he had in years. He would arrive with groceries Harold hadn't asked for, would insist on handling small repairs around the house, and would spend long hours asking about Harold's memories of the old days. Harold had initially felt grateful for the attention, especially since his other grandchildren lived farther away and visited less often. But gradually, he began to notice patterns in Tyler's questions. They always circled back to money, to the farm that Harold still owned on the outskirts of town, to the savings account that Harold's late brother had left him, to the collection of antique furniture that filled Harold's Victorian house on Maple Street. Tyler would ask about these things casually, weaving the questions into conversations about family history, but Harold wasn't foolish enough to miss the underlying current of interest. "You know, Grandpa," Tyler had said just last week while helping Harold organize some old photographs, "you've got quite a valuable place here. Have you ever thought about what you want to happen to it all?" Harold had given him a measured look then. "I've got a will, Tyler. Everything's been taken care of." "Oh, I know," Tyler had replied quickly. "I just meant, it would be good to make sure all the paperwork is in order. These legal things can be complicated." Now, as they walked deeper into the cemetery, Harold wondered if Tyler's sudden interest in spending time with him was entirely altruistic. The thought saddened him more than it frightened him. He had always hoped that his grandchildren loved him for who he was, not for what he might leave behind. The wind died down momentarily, and in the relative quiet, Harold could hear Tyler's breathing. It was controlled, deliberate, as if his grandson was preparing for something. Harold's own breathing had become more difficult, the cold air making his chest tight and his steps unsteady. Each breath felt like work now, a reminder that his body was failing him bit by bit. "Here we are," Tyler announced, stopping beside a section of the cemetery that Harold didn't recognize. Harold looked around, puzzled. They stood near several freshly dug graves, dark rectangles in the earth that awaited their intended occupants. The sight made him dizzy, and he swayed slightly, his grip on Tyler's arm tightening for support. But instead of the steady reassurance he expected, he felt Tyler's arm shift, becoming less supportive, more passive. "Tyler?" Harold's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "What are we doing here?" Tyler didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood quietly, his eyes fixed on the open graves before them. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, becoming cooler, more distant. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Grandpa, about the future, about what happens when you're gone." The words hit Harold like a physical blow, not because of their content, but because of the tone in which they were delivered. There was no warmth there, no sadness at the prospect of loss. Instead, there was something that sounded almost like anticipation. Harold tried to step back, to put some distance between himself and the open graves that suddenly seemed far too close, but Tyler's grip on his arm had become firm again, holding him in place. Not roughly, not violently, but with an insistence that made Harold's heart begin to race. "Tyler, I'd like to go back now," Harold said, his voice stronger despite his growing alarm. "I think I've had enough walking for today." But Tyler seemed not to hear him. His grandson was staring at the graves with an intensity that Harold found deeply unsettling. The young man's jaw was set, his eyes focused, as if he was calculating something that required all his attention. Harold felt the first real flutter of fear then, though he couldn't quite articulate why. They were alone in this remote section, of the cemetery, surrounded by reminders of mortality, and his grandson was acting in a way that seemed entirely foreign to the Tyler he thought he knew. The morning that had begun with what seemed like a caring gesture now felt charged with something else entirely, something that made Harold wish desperately that he had stayed home. The grey sky above them seemed to press down lower, and Harold realized that whatever Tyler had brought him here to see or do, it wasn't going to be the simple cemetery visit he had expected. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything between them, and Harold found himself completely unprepared for whatever his grandson had planned in this lonely place among the graves. The first sign that something was truly wrong came when Harold felt Tyler's arm lose its steadiness, as if it had suddenly become less of a support and more of a burden. He stumbled near the edge of one of the open graves, startled, not immediately, understanding what was happening. His heart accelerated, and for a brief moment he believed that his body, fragile from illness, had simply given way. However, the cold and calculated expression on Tyler's face revealed that nothing had happened by chance. "Tyler!" Harold gasped, his feet scrambling for purchase on the loose earth at the grave's edge. "Help me!" But Tyler stepped back instead of forward, his hands falling away from Harold's arm with deliberate slowness. Harold felt himself losing balance, the medication he took daily making his reflexes slow and uncertain. The world seemed to tilt as he tottered on the brink, and for a terrifying moment he could see nothing but the dark earth below. The fall, when it came, felt both eternal and instantaneous. Harold tumbled into the grave, his frail body hitting the bottom with a dull thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. The walls of earth rose around him like a prison, and the grey sky above seemed impossibly far away. Pain shot through his hip and shoulder, and he lay there for several precious seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. "Tyler," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Tyler, help me up!" Above him, he could see his grandson's silhouette against the overcast sky, but Tyler wasn't moving to help. He was just standing there, looking down at Harold with an expression that made the old man's blood run cold. It wasn't concern or alarm that Harold saw on Tyler's face. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I can't get out on my own," Harold said, his voice growing more strained. The walls of the grave were too high, the earth too loose for him to find proper handholds. His illness had weakened him beyond his ability to climb, even if the grave had been shallow. "Please, Tyler, I need help." Tyler remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth that Harold was accustomed to hearing from his grandson. "You know, Grandpa," Tyler said conversationally, as if Harold weren't trapped 6 feet below him, "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about your will." Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp earth surrounding him. "What about my will?" "Well, it's interesting how you keep everything so secret. Emma thinks she knows what's in it. Jake assumes he'll get the farm, but nobody really knows for sure, do they?" Tyler's voice drifted down from above, casual and measured. "That's a lot of power for one old man to hold over his whole family." "Tyler, please," Harold said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Help me out of here, and we can talk about whatever you want." But Tyler seemed to be in no hurry. He had pulled something from his jacket pocket, a folded paper that he was examining with interest. "I found this in your desk drawer last time I was fixing that loose floorboard in your study. You left the room to make tea, remember? It only took me a minute to look through your papers." Harold's heart sank. The document Tyler held was a copy of his will, a document he had hidden carefully because he knew it would cause family turmoil if its contents were revealed before his passing. The will didn't divide his assets the way his family expected. In fact, it contained some surprises that Tyler clearly hadn't anticipated. "That document is private," Harold managed to say, his voice growing weaker. The cold from the earth was seeping through his clothes, and he was beginning to shiver uncontrollably. "Private, yes," Tyler agreed, "but also very disappointing, at least from my perspective." Harold tried to push himself up from where he lay, but the movement sent sharp pains through his injured hip. He was trapped, both physically and circumstantially, at the mercy of a grandson who clearly wasn't the person Harold had thought him to be. "According to this," Tyler continued, waving the paper, "most of your estate goes to a trust that benefits all your grandchildren equally, but only after they reach 30 years old and demonstrate what you call responsible character. And there's a provision that if any of them tries to contest the will or manipulate you into changing it, they forfeit their entire inheritance." The words hit Harold like physical blows. Tyler had not only violated his privacy, but had discovered the very provisions Harold had put in place to protect his family from exactly this kind of manipulation. "There's more, though," Tyler went on, his voice taking on a harder edge. "A significant portion of your assets are designated for something called the Millbrook Community Foundation. Money for scholarships, for fixing up the old library, for helping families in need. Very noble, Grandpa. Very disappointing." Harold closed his eyes, understanding now why Tyler had brought him to this remote part of the cemetery. His grandson had planned this confrontation, had chosen this location where no one would interrupt. Them, where Harold would be vulnerable and unable to simply walk away from an uncomfortable conversation. "You planned this," Harold said quietly. "I planned a conversation," Tyler replied. "I didn't plan for you to be so clumsy near the grave, but sometimes circumstances work in our favor." The words chilled Harold more than the damp earth. Tyler was already crafting a story, already preparing to explain away this incident as an accident. And from Harold's position at the bottom of the grave, with no witnesses around, who would contradict Tyler's version of events? "What do you want?" Harold asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "I want you to understand something," Tyler said, crouching down at the edge of the grave so his voice wouldn't have to carry so far. "I'm 26 years old. I have debts, I have ambitions, I have a life to live. I can't wait until I'm 30 to access my inheritance, and I certainly can't watch you give away half our family's money to strangers." "Those aren't strangers," Harold protested weakly. "They're your neighbors, your community." "They're not my family," Tyler shot back, "and family should come first." Harold tried again to stand, but his strength was failing him. The cold was making his joints stiff, and the pain in his hip was becoming more intense. He realized with growing alarm that even if Tyler decided to help him now, he might not be able to climb out of the grave without assistance from multiple people. "Tyler, listen to me," Harold said, trying to inject authority into his voice despite his circumstances. "Even if I wanted to change my will, I can't do it from the bottom of a grave. Help me up, take me home, and we can discuss this properly." "Oh, we're going to discuss it," Tyler assured him. "But I think you'll find that your current position gives you a new perspective on things. Makes you realize how much you depend on the kindness of others. Makes you think about what might happen if that kindness wasn't available." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Harold felt a wave of despair wash over him as he realized that his grandson was prepared to leave him in this grave, to abandon him here in this remote section of the cemetery where his calls for help might go unheard for hours or even days. "You're my grandson," Harold whispered, as much to himself as to Tyler. "Martha's grandson. How did it come to this?" Tyler's expression softened slightly at the mention of Harold's late wife, but only for a moment. Grandma Martha died 5 years ago, Grandpa. She's not here to see what happens next. It's just you and me now, and we need to come to an understanding. Harold looked up at the young man who had once been his pride and joy, who had sat on his lap as a child and listened to stories about the old days, who had helped him plant vegetables in the backyard garden every spring. That little boy was gone, replaced by someone Harold didn't recognize, someone capable of leaving his own grandfather trapped and vulnerable for the sake of money. The wind picked up again, whistling across the open grave and making Harold shiver more violently. Above him, Tyler stood up and brushed dirt from his knees, apparently in no hurry to resolve the situation. The isolation of their location was becoming more apparent with each passing moment, and Harold realized that Tyler had chosen this spot very carefully indeed. "Please," Harold said one more time, hating the way his voice sounded so small and defeated. "Don't do this." Tyler looked down at him with what might have been regret, but Harold could no longer trust his ability to read his grandson's expressions. Everything he had believed about Tyler, about their relationship, about the kind of person his grandson was, had been revealed to be either incomplete or entirely false. "I'm not doing anything, Grandpa," Tyler said quietly. "I'm just giving you some time to think, time to consider what's really important, time to decide whether you want your family to benefit from your life's work or whether you want to be remembered as the man who chose strangers over his own blood." The words echoed in the confines of the grave as Tyler turned and walked away, leaving Harold alone with the growing darkness and the terrible realization that his own grandson had become someone he no longer knew. It was in this moment, when everything seemed to be heading toward the worst possible outcome, that an unexpected presence emerged. The strong bark of a German shepherd cut through the silence, coming from a distant point, approaching rapidly. The animal, Harold's faithful companion for years, had escaped from home and followed his trail to the cemetery. The sound of the dog's paws running between the headstones interrupted the apparent tranquility and completely changed the atmosphere. Rex had been Harold's constant companion since Martha's passing, a loyal friend who seemed to understand the old man's grief better than any human could. The massive dog had been restless all morning, pacing by the front door and whimpering in a way that Harold's neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, couldn't ignore. When Harold failed to return from what Tyler had described as a short walk to the cemetery, Rex had somehow managed to slip his collar and escape from the backyard where Mrs. Peterson had been watching him. The German shepherd's powerful form bounded between the weathered headstones with surprising grace for such a large animal. His dark coat gleamed even in the grey morning light, and his intelligent eyes scanned the cemetery grounds with the focused intensity of a trained search dog. Rex had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to find Harold, no matter where the old man had wandered during his increasingly frequent moments of confusion brought on by his medication. Tyler, who had been walking slowly back toward the main path of the cemetery, froze at the sound of the approaching barks. He had assumed he would have hours before anyone noticed Harold's absence, plenty of time to return and discover his grandfather's unfortunate accident. The appearance of the dog changed everything about his carefully laid plans. "Rex?" Harold's voice echoed from within the grave, relief and hope flooding through him at the familiar sound. "Rex, I'm here!" The German shepherd's barks became more urgent as he pinpointed Harold's location. Within moments, the powerful animal came into view, his ears alert and his body tense with purpose. When Rex saw Tyler standing near the open grave, the dog's demeanor changed instantly. His lips curled back to reveal sharp white teeth, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Tyler instinctively stepped backward, his confidence evaporating in the face of 80 pounds of protective canine instinct. "Easy, Rex," he said, his voice betraying his nervousness. "It's just me, it's Tyler." But Rex showed no sign of recognition or friendliness. Instead, the dog positioned himself between Tyler and the grave, where Harold lay trapped, his body language making it clear that he would tolerate no further approach from the young man. "Rex," Harold called again, his voice stronger now that help had arrived. "Good boy, I'm down here." Without hesitation, Rex leaped into the grave, landing gracefully beside Harold despite the 6-foot drop. The dog immediately began checking his master for injuries, nudging Harold's face with his cold nose and whimpering softly at the old man's obvious distress. "I'm okay, boy," Harold whispered, burying his face in Rex's thick fur. "I'm okay now. That you're here." Rex's presence transformed everything. The dog's warmth helped combat the chill that had been seeping into Harold's bones, and his solid, reassuring presence gave Harold the emotional strength he needed to think clearly about his situation. More importantly, Rex's arrival meant that Tyler could no longer simply walk away and leave Harold trapped. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding," Tyler called down into the grave, his voice taking on the false joviality he had used when they first arrived at the cemetery. "A grandpa just lost his footing. I was about to go get help." Rex's response was a sharp bark that clearly conveyed his disbelief. The dog had positioned himself protectively next to Harold, his intelligent eyes never leaving Tyler's face. Harold, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Tyler hadn't simply abandoned him in the grave. He had been prepared to leave Harold there indefinitely, perhaps returning hours later with a story about how his grandfather had wandered off and suffered an unfortunate accident. The realization made Harold feel sick to his stomach. "Tyler," Harold said, his voice carrying a new note of authority despite his circumstances, "I want you to go get help, right now." "Of course, Grandpa," Tyler replied, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he crouched down at the edge of the grave again, his eyes calculating. "But first, maybe we should finish our conversation about the will." Rex's growl intensified, and the dog shifted position to place himself more directly between Harold and Tyler. The message was unmistakable. Any threat to Harold would have to go through Rex first. It was then that a new voice cut through the tension. "Is everything all right over here?" Margaret Walsh, the cemetery's groundskeeper for the past 15 years, had been making her morning rounds when she heard the barking. A sturdy woman in her 50s with graying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, Margaret knew every inch of Millbrook Cemetery and was immediately suspicious of finding people in the remote section where graves were prepared, but not yet occupied. Tyler sprang to his feet, his face flushing with what Harold recognized as guilt and panic. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," Tyler said, his voice overly loud and enthusiastic. "My grandfather seems to have had an accident." Margaret approached cautiously, her experienced eyes taking in the scene with growing suspicion. She had seen Tyler around town, knew him by reputation as someone who had trouble holding jobs and often asked family members for money. She also knew Harold Whitmore by sight, a respected member of the community who had never struck her as particularly clumsy or prone to accidents. "Mr. Whitmore?" Margaret called down into the grave, ignoring Tyler for the moment. "Are you hurt?" "Sir? I'm not seriously injured," Harold replied, his voice carrying clearly in the cool air. "But I can't get out on my own." Margaret pulled a two-way radio from her belt and called for backup from the cemetery's maintenance crew. Her movements were efficient and professional, but Harold noticed that she kept glancing at Tyler with poorly concealed suspicion. "How exactly did this happen?" Margaret asked Tyler, her tone neutral but probing. Tyler's story came out in a rush, too detailed and too rehearsed. He explained how they had been walking through the cemetery when Harold suddenly became dizzy and stumbled toward the grave, how Tyler had tried to catch him, but hadn't been quick enough. How he had been just about to go for help when Rex arrived and then Margaret showed up. As Tyler talked, Rex continued to growl softly, his ears flat against his head, in a way that Harold had learned to recognize as the dog's signal that something was wrong. Margaret noticed this too, her eyebrows rising slightly as she observed the German Shepherd's obvious agitation toward Tyler. "It's funny," Margaret said conversationally, "but Rex here doesn't seem to think much of your version of events. Dogs can get confused in stressful situations," Tyler replied quickly. "He's just upset because Grandpa fell." But Margaret wasn't buying it. She had worked with animals her entire adult life, first on her family's farm and then here at the cemetery where she often dealt with the dogs that accompanied grieving families. She knew the difference between an animal's general distress and its specific protective behavior toward a perceived threat. "Rex," she called gently. "Come here, boy." The German Shepherd looked at Harold, who nodded slightly. Only then did Rex leap out of the grave with the same graceful bound he had used to enter it. But instead of going to Margaret, the dog moved to where Tyler was standing and began sniffing around the young man's feet with obvious interest. "What's he doing?" Tyler asked nervously, taking a step backward. Margaret watched with growing interest as Rex continued his investigation. The dog suddenly stopped at a spot near Tyler's shoes and began pawing at something in the grass. When Margaret looked closer, she could see what appeared to be a torn piece of paper, partially buried in the loose earth that had been scattered around the gravesite. "What's that?" Margaret asked, bending down to retrieve the paper. Tyler's face went pale. "I don't know. Just some trash, probably." But as Margaret unfolded the document, it became clear that it was anything but trash. The paper was expensive, legal quality stock, and bore the letterhead of Millbrook's only law firm. Most of the text was torn away, but the words "Last Will" and "Testament" were clearly visible at the top, along with Harold Whitmore's name. "Mr. Whitmore," Margaret called down to Harold, "did you bring any legal documents with you today?" Harold's voice was quiet but clear. "No, I didn't bring anything like that." Margaret looked at Tyler with undisguised suspicion now. "Then how did this end up scattered around this gravesite?" Tyler's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I don't know. Maybe it fell out of Grandpa's pocket when he fell." "From 6 feet down." Margaret's voice was skeptical. "Paper doesn't usually fly upward out of holes in the ground, son." Rex had returned to his position next to the grave, but he kept his attention focused on Tyler. The dog's behavior was making Margaret more suspicious by the minute, and she found herself wondering if Harold's fall had been quite as accidental as Tyler claimed. "You know what?" Margaret said, folding the torn document carefully and tucking it into her jacket pocket. "I think we should wait for the maintenance crew to get here before we do anything else. And maybe we should call Sheriff Martinez too, just to document the accident properly." Tyler's reaction was immediate and telling. "Oh, that's not necessary. It was just a simple accident. No need to involve law enforcement." But Margaret had already pulled out her radio again. Harold, listening from the bottom of the grave with Rex's warm body pressed against his side, felt a surge of hope. For the first time since Tyler had brought him to this remote part of the cemetery, he believed that someone might actually discover the truth about what had happened here. The morning that had begun with what seemed like a grandson's caring gesture was revealing itself to be something far more sinister. And Harold realized that without Rex's intervention and Margaret's suspicious nature, he might have found himself in a situation with no witnesses and no way to prove that Tyler's version of events wasn't the truth. The maintenance crew arrived within 10 minutes, followed shortly by Sheriff Martinez in his patrol car. Margaret had been right to call for official documentation. What had initially appeared to be a simple accident was beginning to reveal itself as something much more complex. As the crew set up equipment to safely extract Harold from the grave, Margaret pulled Sheriff Martinez aside and showed him the torn document that Rex had uncovered. "This is interesting," Sheriff Martinez said, examining the paper carefully. A man in his 40s who had grown up in Millbrook, he knew the Whitmore family well and had always respected Harold as one of the community's most honest citizens. "Mr. Whitmore," he called down to Harold, "can you tell me why a portion of what appears to be your will ended up scattered around this grave site?" Harold looked up at Tyler, who was standing at the edge of the group, his face pale and his hands clenched at his sides. The old man felt a mixture of disappointment and sadness as he realized that his suspicions about his grandson's motives had been correct all along. "I didn't bring that document with me today," Harold said clearly, "but I believe Tyler may have taken it from my house without my permission." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Tyler stepped forward quickly, his voice rising with what sounded like injured innocence. "That's not true! Why would I take Grandpa's will? That doesn't even make sense." But Sheriff Martinez had noticed something else. Tyler's jacket pocket was torn, and there appeared to be small pieces of matching paper still caught in the fabric. When he pointed this out, Tyler looked down at his jacket with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I don't know how that got there," Tyler said, his voice becoming defensive. "Maybe when I was trying to help Grandpa, the paper got caught somehow." Margaret wasn't buying it. "Son, that document was buried under about an inch of loose soil. If it had just fallen out during the accident, it would have been sitting on top of the ground. Someone deliberately tried to hide it." As the maintenance crew lowered a ladder into the grave, Harold felt Rex press closer to his side. The German Shepherd had been remarkably calm throughout the arrival of the additional people, but his attention never wavered from Tyler. The dog's instincts were proving more reliable than Harold had ever imagined. "Let's get you out of there," burst Mr. Whitmore, Sheriff Martinez said. "Then we can sort out the details." The extraction process took several minutes. Harold's hip was sore from the fall, and he needed assistance from 2 crew members to climb the ladder. Rex bounded out of the grave on his own, immediately positioning himself between Harold and Tyler once again. Once Harold was on solid ground, wrapped in a blanket that Margaret had retrieved from the groundskeeper's office, Sheriff Martinez began asking more detailed questions about the morning's events. Tyler's story remained consistent, but Harold noticed that his grandson's eyes kept darting toward the parking area, as if he was calculating whether he could simply leave. "Tyler," Harold said quietly, "I think it's time you told everyone the real reason you brought me here today." Tyler's jaw tightened. "I told you, Grandpa. We came to visit Grandma Martha's grave." "Martha's grave is in the opposite direction," Margaret interjected. "I've been working here for 15 years. I know where every grave in this cemetery is located." Sheriff Martinez was putting the pieces together. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have reason to believe that Tyler was trying to coerce you into changing your will?" Harold nodded slowly. "He's been asking a lot of questions about my estate, planning lately. And this morning after I fell into the grave, he told me he had found a copy of my will in my house. He seemed disappointed with its contents." "What kind of disappointed?" the sheriff asked. Harold glanced at Tyler, who was now looking genuinely panicked. "The kind of disappointed that comes from learning that most of my estate is going to benefit the community rather than individual family members." This revelation seemed to galvanize Tyler. "That's not fair," he burst out. "We're your family. We're the ones who should benefit from everything you've worked for, not a bunch of strangers." Sheriff Martinez raised an eyebrow. "So you did know the contents of your grandfather's will?" Tyler realized his mistake immediately. I... I mean, he just told me about it when he was down in the grave. Actually, Harold said calmly, you told me that you had found the document in my desk drawer last week when you were supposedly fixing a floorboard in my study. Margaret was taking notes now, and Sheriff Martinez was looking at Tyler with the expression of a law enforcement officer who had heard one too many inconsistent stories. Tyler, the sheriff said, I think you need to be very careful about what you say next. Breaking and entering, theft of legal documents, and elder abuse are serious charges. I didn't break in, Tyler protested. I had permission to be in the house, and I didn't steal anything. Taking someone's private legal documents without permission is theft, Sheriff Martinez replied, and deliberately endangering an elderly person is definitely abuse. Tyler looked around desperately, as if searching for support from the assembled group, but Margaret was shaking her head disapprovingly. The maintenance crew was avoiding eye contact, and Rex was still watching Tyler with obvious distrust. Look, Tyler said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. I just wanted to talk to him about the will. I wanted him to understand how unfair it is. So you brought him to an isolated part of the cemetery and let him fall into an open grave? Margaret's voice was incredulous. It was an accident. He really did lose his balance. And then you decided to use his vulnerable position to try to manipulate him into changing his will, Sheriff Martinez concluded. That's not an accident, son. That's a plan. Harold felt a deep sadness settling over him. Tyler wasn't just greedy. He was also apparently not very bright. If he had simply asked Harold directly about the will, if he had expressed his concerns about his future in an honest conversation, Harold might have been willing to help him in other ways. The farm could have provided Tyler with work. The antique furniture could have been sold to help him pay his debts. There were solutions that didn't involve betraying family trust or endangering an elderly man's safety. Tyler, Harold said gently, why didn't you just talk to me? If you were having financial problems, if you were worried about your future, we could have found a way to help you. Tyler's expression crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the confused child Harold remembered from years past. You don't understand, Tyler said, his voice breaking. I owe money to people who aren't patient. I needed a solution, and I needed it fast. This admission caught everyone's attention. Sheriff Martinez stepped closer to Tyler, his expression growing more serious. What kind of people? The sheriff asked. Tyler shook his head, realizing he had said too much. Just business associates, people I borrowed money from. Tyler, Harold said firmly, are you in some kind of danger? The young man's silence was answer enough. Margaret exchanged a look with Sheriff Martinez, and Harold realized that Tyler's desperate attempt to manipulate him into changing his will might have been motivated by more than simple greed. If Tyler owed money to dangerous people, his actions might have been driven by fear rather than pure selfishness. How much do you owe? Harold asked quietly. Tyler's response was barely audible. $40,000. The number hit Harold like a physical blow. It was a substantial amount, but not impossible to manage. If Tyler had come to him honestly, Harold could have helped him work out a solution. The farm was worth far more than $40,000, and there were other assets that could have been liquidated in an emergency. Tyler, Harold said sadly, $40,000 isn't worth destroying our relationship. Over. It's not worth risking your freedom or my safety. We could have figured something out. But Tyler wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at the ground, his shoulders shaking with what might have been tears or might have been fear. The young man, who had seemed so calculating and dangerous just an hour earlier, now looked like what he was, a scared kid who had made a series of increasingly bad decisions and found himself in a situation he couldn't control. Sheriff Martinez was watching Tyler with a mixture of professional suspicion and human sympathy. "Tyler, I need you to tell me who you owe this money to. If you're being threatened, we can help you, but we can't help if you don't tell us the truth." Tyler looked up at his grandfather, and Harold saw something in his grandson's eyes that he hadn't seen since Tyler was a small child, a desperate need for help and protection. "I messed up, Grandpa," Tyler whispered. "I messed up really bad, and I didn't know how to fix it." Harold felt his anger beginning to fade, replaced by the protective instincts that had governed his relationship with his grandchildren since they were born. Tyler had made terrible choices, but he was still family, and Harold had never been the type of man to abandon family in crisis. "We'll figure it out," Harold said firmly. "But first, you need to tell Sheriff Martinez everything, all of it." Tyler's confession came slowly, in halting pieces that painted a picture of desperation and increasingly poor judgment. He had borrowed money from a group of men who operated what they called an investment club, but which sounded to Sheriff Martinez more like an illegal lending operation. The initial loan had been for $10,000, but with interest and penalties, it had ballooned to the current $40,000 debt. "They told me I had 2 weeks to pay it back, or they'd start collecting from my family members," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know where Emma works. They know where Jake lives with his kids. They made it clear that everyone I care about would be at risk if I don't pay." Harold felt his heart breaking as he listened to his grandson's story. Tyler had fallen into a trap that had ensnared many young people in small towns across America, lured by promises of easy money and then trapped by escalating debt and threats of violence. "Why didn't you come to me immediately when this started?" Harold asked. "Why did you let it get this far?" Tyler's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was ashamed, because I thought I could handle it on my own, and because—" he paused, struggling with the words, "because I knew you'd be disappointed in me." Sheriff Martinez had been taking notes throughout Tyler's confession, and now he looked up with a thoughtful expression. "Tyler, I'm going to need names and locations for these people you borrowed from. This kind of operation is illegal, and they've been on our radar for a while." But Tyler shook his head frantically. "I can't give you names. If they think I've talked to the police, they'll hurt my family for sure." "They're already threatening to hurt your family," Margaret pointed out. "Seems to me like talking to the police might be your best option." Harold was thinking rapidly, his mind working through possibilities and solutions. $40,000 was a significant amount, but it wasn't insurmountable. The real question was whether paying off Tyler's debt would actually solve the problem or just enable him to make similar mistakes in the future. "Tyler," Harold said carefully, "even if we could solve this debt problem, what makes you think you wouldn't end up in the same situation again in a few months?" Tyler looked at his grandfather with surprise. "You would actually help me after what I did today?" Harold's answer came without hesitation. "You're my grandson. Of course I would help you, but I need to know that you understand why you're in this situation and that you're committed to making better choices going forward." Rex, who had been lying quietly beside Harold throughout the conversation, suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the cemetery entrance. His ears were alert, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. A moment later, they all heard the sound of car doors slamming and voices approaching. "That would be Emma and Jake," Sheriff Martinez said, consulting his radio. "I called them when it became clear that this was more than just a simple accident." Harold felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Emma and Jake were Tyler's siblings, and Harold knew that they would be shocked to learn about their brother's actions. But he also knew that they would want to help, and their presence might provide the emotional support that Tyler clearly needed. Emma arrived first, her face pale with worry. At 32, she was the eldest of Harold's grandchildren and had always been the most responsible. She worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital and had inherited her grandmother Martha's practical, no-nonsense approach to problems. "Grandpa," she exclaimed, rushing to Harold's side. "Are you hurt?" When Sheriff Martinez called, he said there had been an accident. "I'm fine, dear," Harold assured her, accepting her embrace gratefully. "Just a little shaken up." Jake arrived moments later, his construction boots crunching on the gravel path. At 29, he was the middle child, married with 2 young children of his own. He took one look at the scene. The open grave, the scattered equipment, Tyler's tear-stained face, and the serious expressions of the adults, and immediately understood that something significant had happened. "What's going on here?" Jake asked, his voice cautious. Sheriff Martinez gestured to the group. "Perhaps we should all go somewhere more comfortable to have this conversation. Mr. Whitmore, would you be willing to continue this discussion at your house?" Harold nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted by the morning's events. Margaret offered to drive him home, while Sheriff Martinez indicated that he would transport Tyler in his patrol car. Emma and Jake could follow in their own vehicles. The procession to Harold's Victorian house on Maple Street took only a few minutes, but it felt longer to Harold as he contemplated how to explain Tyler's actions to Emma and Jake. Rex sat beside him in Margaret's truck, his warm presence providing comfort during the difficult ride. Once they were all settled in Harold's living room, the same room where Tyler had supposedly been fixing a floorboard the week before, Sheriff Martinez began explaining the situation. To Emma and Jake, their expressions changed from confusion to shock to anger as they learned about Tyler's attempted manipulation and the circumstances that had led to it. "Tyler, how could you?" Emma's voice was filled with disappointment. "Grandpa has always been there for all of us. How could you put him in danger like that?" Tyler couldn't meet his sister's eyes. "I was scared, Emma. These people, they're not the kind of people you can reason with. They made it clear that they would hurt anyone I care about if I don't pay them back." Jake stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "So your solution was to try to con Grandpa into changing his will, to leave him trapped in a grave until he agreed to give you money?" "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Tyler protested weakly. "I just wanted to talk to him, to make him understand how much I needed help." "By threatening him?" Jake's voice rose. "By abandoning him in a hole in the ground?" Harold raised a hand to calm the growing argument. "Fighting among ourselves isn't going to solve anything," he said firmly. "We need to focus on finding a solution." Emma looked at her grandfather with concern. "What kind of solution?" "Grandpa, you can't seriously be thinking of paying off his debt after what he did." Harold was quiet for a long moment, considering his options. The torn will document that Rex had found was still in Sheriff Martinez's possession, but Harold remembered every word of its contents. The trust fund he had established would provide for all of his grandchildren eventually, but not until they demonstrated maturity and responsibility. Tyler's actions today had certainly not demonstrated either quality. "Tyler," Harold said finally, "I want you to understand something. The will you found, the one that disappointed you so much, was designed to protect you and your siblings from exactly this kind of situation. Money that comes too easily often disappears just as easily." Tyler looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if I had left you a large inheritance at age 18 or 21, you might have ended up in an even worse situation than you're in now. Easy money can lead to poor decisions, and poor decisions can lead to exactly the kind of people you're dealing with now." Emma nodded slowly, beginning to understand her grandfather's reasoning. The trust fund requires us to demonstrate responsible character before we can access the money. Exactly, Harold confirmed, and it includes provisions that protect the inheritance from being seized by creditors or lost to poor financial decisions. Jake was also beginning to see the wisdom in his grandfather's planning. So even if Tyler had succeeded in getting you to change the will, the money might not have actually solved his problem. Worse than that, Harold said sadly. If these people knew Tyler had access to a large inheritance, they might have simply increased their demands. 40,000 could have become 100,000 or more. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications of Harold's words. Tyler looked up at his grandfather with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I never thought of it that way," Tyler admitted. "I just saw the money as a solution to all my problems." Sheriff Martinez had been listening to the family conversation with interest, and now he leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Whitmore, I have to ask, are you planning to press charges against Tyler for what happened today?" The question hung in the air as Harold considered his response. Tyler had certainly committed crimes, theft of documents, elder abuse, possibly attempted extortion. But he was also Harold's grandson, a young man who had made terrible decisions under pressure, but who seemed genuinely remorseful. "I want Tyler to get help," Harold said finally. "Professional help for the gambling or whatever led him to borrow money from these people, and I want him to cooperate fully with your investigation of this illegal lending operation." Tyler's relief was visible. "I'll do anything you want, Grandpa. I'll go to counseling. I'll testify against those guys, whatever you need." But Harold wasn't finished. "However, there will be consequences. The trust fund provisions include clauses about attempting to manipulate or coerce the grantor. Your actions today have triggered those clauses." Emma and Jake exchanged glances, understanding that their brother had not only endangered their grandfather, but had also potentially forfeited his inheritance entirely. "What does that mean exactly?" Jake asked quietly. Harold looked at Tyler with sadness, but also with determination. "It means that Tyler's portion of the trust fund will be redistributed to the Millbrook Community Foundation and to the two of you, provided you continue to demonstrate responsible behavior." The impact of these words hit Tyler like a physical blow. Not only had his plan failed, but his actions had cost him any chance of benefiting from his grandfather's estate in the future. But Harold wasn't done yet. There is, however, one way for Tyler to potentially restore his place in the trust. All eyes turned to Harold as he prepared to reveal the full extent of his planning and the true test that would determine Tyler's future. Harold stood up slowly, his movement still careful due to his sore hip, and walked to the old oak desk that had belonged to his father. From the bottom drawer, he withdrew a sealed envelope that bore Tyler's name in Martha's distinctive handwriting. The sight of the envelope caused a collective intake of breath from everyone in the room. "Your grandmother wrote this letter shortly before she passed away," Harold explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She wrote one for each of you, actually, but with specific instructions about when they should be opened." Emma leaned forward, her nurse's training making her attentive to Harold's emotional state. "What kind of instructions, Grandpa?" "Martha was wiser than any of us gave her credit for," Harold said, settling back into his favorite armchair with Rex at his feet. "She knew that each of you would face different challenges as you grew into adulthood. She asked me to give these letters to you when you needed them most, not necessarily when you wanted them most." Jake's eyes were fixed on the envelope in Harold's hands. What did Grandma Martha know about Tyler's situation? Harold smiled sadly. She didn't know the specifics, but she understood Tyler's personality better than he understood it himself. She knew he was impulsive, that he had a tendency to look for shortcuts, and that he would probably find himself in serious trouble at some point in his young adult life. Tyler, who had been silent since learning about his forfeited inheritance, looked up with tears in his eyes. "She wrote me a letter, even though she knew I would mess up?" "Especially because she knew you would mess up," Harold confirmed. Martha believed that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, but she also believed that redemption had to be earned through genuine change and sacrifice. Sheriff Martinez watched the family interaction with professional interest. He had seen many families torn apart by financial disputes and criminal behavior, but he had rarely witnessed the kind of thoughtful preparation that Harold and Martha had invested in their family's future. Harold carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Martha's handwriting was still clear and strong, despite the illness that had claimed her life shortly after she wrote it. "Tyler," Harold read aloud, "if you are hearing this letter, it means you have found yourself in serious trouble. Probably involving money, and probably because you were looking for an easy solution to a complicated problem. I want you to know that your grandfather and I always knew this day might come, and we want you to know that we love you anyway." Tyler's shoulders began to shake with silent sobs as Harold continued reading. "You have always been our most sensitive grandchild, which makes you both the most vulnerable to manipulation and the most capable of genuine empathy. The same qualities that led you into trouble can also lead you back out of it, but only if you're willing to do the hard work of changing your approach to life." "Butim." Emma reached over and took Tyler's hand, her earlier anger giving way to compassion as she heard their grandmother's words. "If you are ready to accept help and guidance," Harold continued, "your grandfather will provide you with the resources. You need to solve your immediate problem, but in exchange, you must commit to a program of service and personal growth that will prove you understand the value of money earned through honest work rather than inherited through family connections." Jake nodded approvingly. Their grandmother had always been practical about consequences and rewards. Harold paused in his reading to look directly at Tyler. "The program Martha designed for you is extensive. You would work on the farm for 2 years, learning agricultural management and business planning. You would attend counseling sessions to address whatever led you to make these dangerous financial decisions. And you would volunteer at the community center, working with other young people who are facing similar challenges." Tyler wiped his eyes and looked at his grandfather with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "And if I complete the program?" Harold smiled. "Then your portion of the trust fund would be restored, and you would also inherit the farm itself, with the understanding that you would use it to continue helping other young people who find themselves in trouble." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Martha's plan. She had anticipated Tyler's crisis and had designed a path toward redemption that would benefit not only Tyler, but the entire community. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "This is all very touching, but we still have the matter of Tyler's debt to these illegal lenders. Even if he commits to this program, those people aren't going to wait 2 years for their money." Harold nodded. "I'm prepared to pay off Tyler's debt immediately, but with conditions. The money will be paid directly to the lenders through official channels, with full documentation that can be used in your investigation. Tyler will provide you with all the information you need to prosecute them for illegal lending practices." Tyler looked up quickly. "But they said they would hurt my family if I talked to the police." "They also said they would hurt your family if you didn't pay them," Emma pointed out. "At least this way, they'll be in jail and unable to hurt anyone." Sheriff Martinez was already reaching for his phone. "If you're serious about this, Mr. Whitmore, I can have some officers standing by when we make contact with these lenders. We can ensure Tyler's safety during the handoff." Harold looked at Tyler seriously. But you have to understand, this is your one chance. If you accept my help in Martha's program, there won't be any more bailouts. You'll succeed or fail based on your own efforts from that point forward. Tyler didn't hesitate. I accept all of it. The work program, the counseling, the testimony against those guys. I accept everything. Margaret, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, spoke up for the first time since they had arrived at the house. Mr. Whitmore, I have to say, what you and your wife planned is remarkable. Most people don't think that far ahead about their family's needs. Harold's eyes grew misty as he thought about Martha. She was the smartest person I ever knew. Even facing her own passing, she was thinking about how to help her grandchildren long after she was gone. Rex, sensing his master's emotional state, got up from his position by the chair and rested his head on Harold's lap. The German shepherd had been the quiet hero of the day, and Harold stroked his fur gratefully. You know, Harold said to Rex, if you hadn't shown up when you did, Tyler might have gotten away with his plan. You're the real reason we're all here together, working toward a solution instead of dealing with a tragedy. Emma smiled at the dog. Rex always did have good instincts about people. Jake was looking thoughtful. Grandpa, what's in our letters? From Grandma Martha? Harold chuckled. Emma's letter is to be opened when she decides to get married, if she ever does. It contains Martha's advice about choosing a life partner and building a strong marriage. Yours, Jake, is to be opened when your children reach school age. It's full of Martha's thoughts about raising children with good values in a complicated world. Both siblings looked surprised and pleased to learn that their grandmother had been thinking about their futures as well. Sheriff Martinez stood up, ready to begin the process of resolving Tyler's legal problems. Tyler, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station to give a full statement about these lenders. We'll coordinate with Mr. Whitmore to set up the debt payment in a way that ensures everyone's safety. Tyler stood up as well, looking more mature than he had in years. Sheriff, will I be facing charges for what I did to my grandfather? Sheriff Martinez looked at Harold questioningly. Harold considered the question carefully before answering. I think the consequences outlined in Martha's program are more appropriate than jail time, Harold said. But if Tyler fails to follow through on any part of our agreement, I reserve the right to reconsider that decision. Tyler nodded solemnly. I understand, Grandpa, and I promise you won't regret giving me this chance. As the afternoon sun began to filter through the windows of Harold's living room, the crisis that had begun with Tyler's desperate plan in the cemetery was transforming into an opportunity for growth and redemption. Martha's wisdom, expressed through letters written years earlier, had provided a framework for healing that none of them could have anticipated. Emma stood up and hugged Tyler tightly. I'm proud of you for accepting help, she whispered to her brother. Grandma Martha would be proud too. Jake joined the embrace, and for a moment, Harold felt as if Martha was there with them, watching her. Grandchildren support each other through a difficult time. As Tyler prepared to leave with Sheriff Martinez to begin the process of resolving his legal troubles, Harold felt a sense of peace that had been missing from his life since Martha's passing. The day had revealed painful truths about his family, but it had also shown him that Martha's love and wisdom continued to guide them even years after her passing. Rex settled back down beside Harold's chair, his tail wagging slightly as if he, too, understood that the crisis had passed. The German shepherd had proven himself to be more than just a pet. He was truly a member of the family, with instincts that had saved them all from a much darker outcome. Margaret gathered her things and prepared to return to the cemetery. Mr. Whitmore, I'll make sure that gravesite is properly secured. And I'll include Rex in my report as an honorary member of the cemetery security team. Harold laughed. I think he'd like that. He's always taken his protective duties very seriously. As the various officials and family members began to disperse, Harold reflected on the strange turns the day had taken. What had begun as Tyler's attempt to manipulate him had ended up revealing the depth of Martha's continued influence on their family. Her letters, written with the foresight of someone who understood human nature deeply, had provided exactly the guidance they needed when they needed it most. Tyler paused at the door before leaving with Sheriff Martinez. Grandpa, I know I can't undo what I did today, but I want you to know that I'm going to spend every day of the next 2 years proving that Grandma Martha was right to believe in me. Harold smiled at his youngest grandson. Martha was always right about the important things. I have faith that you'll prove her right about this too. As the house grew quiet again, with only Emma remaining to help Harold process the day's events, Harold felt grateful for the strange way everything had worked out. Tyler's crisis had revealed family strengths they didn't know they possessed, and Martha's letters had provided a roadmap for healing that honored both justice and mercy. The grey morning that had begun with deception and manipulation had transformed into an afternoon filled with truth, accountability, and hope for the future. And as Harold settled into his chair with Rex at his side and Emma making tea in the kitchen, he felt Martha's presence more strongly than he had since her passing, reminding him that love and wisdom could triumph over fear and greed when families chose to support each other through their darkest moments. Dear listeners, we hope that Harold and Tyler's story has moved you and shown you the power of family love, forgiveness, and second chances. Martha's wisdom reminds us that even in our darkest moments, there can be hope for redemption when we're willing to do the hard work of change. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the triumph of love over adversity. Share your thoughts about Harold's decision to give Tyler a second chance in the comments below. Would you have made the same choice? Don't miss our upcoming stories about family, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways that love can transform even the most difficult situations. We'll see you in the comments and in our next story.